March 1945. Inside a shattered German farmhouse being used as an American aid station, a captured SS officer raised his hand and struck a medic across the face. Not a rifleman, not a guard, a medic. A man wearing a Red Cross brassard, standing in a room where the wounded were supposed to be protected from the war outside. For 1 second, nobody moved. The American soldiers in that room knew what men like that SS officer had already done across Europe. They knew about prisoners shot after surrender. They knew about villages burned, civilians driven out, bodies left in ditches, and rules treated like jokes by men who believed uniforms made them untouchable. And they also knew something else. The report was going to reach George S. Patton. Patton, the general whose name meant speed, armor, profanity, polished boots, ivory-handled pistols, and an appetite for battle that frightened even men on his own side. Patton, the man who had almost ruined his career with a slap. So, when that captured officer was brought into Patton's world, everyone expected the old Patton to answer him. A fist. A threat. A beating no one would write down. A little battlefield justice behind a closed door. But that is not what happened. Patton looked at the prisoner and chose paperwork. Not weak paperwork. Not ceremonial paperwork. The kind that creates witnesses, names, dates, charges, signatures, and a record that cannot be shouted down later. The SS officer had struck a protected man in a protected place. Patton made sure the answer would be protected by law, and that is why this small incident matters. Because the strangest thing about law in wartime is that it only proves itself when violence would be easier. By the first week of March 1945, Germany was cracking open, not collapsing neatly. Cracking. One town at a time, one bridge at a time, one exhausted unit after another, throwing down rifles because the Reich had promised victory and delivered only mud, hunger, and American engines coming from the west. Patton's Third Army had been moving for months with almost inhuman pressure. Since the breakout from Normandy, his men had crossed France, fought through the cold of the Ardennes campaign, pushed past rivers, forests, villages, supply breakdowns, and German counterattacks that arrived too late and died too hard. These were not parade soldiers. They were clerks, farmers, mechanics, students, dock workers, boys who had learned in 2 years what professional armies take generations to learn. They knew how to move. They knew how to kill. They knew how to keep going when sleep became a luxury and fear became background noise. And because Third Army moved so fast, it carried a strange world behind the front line. Command posts in schoolhouses, telephone wire strung through smashed windows, map tables laid across kitchen doors, prisoners packed into barns. Aid stations set up wherever the walls were thick enough to survive shell fragments. One of those aid stations sat in a battered farmhouse west of the Rhine approaches. The place was not clean. It was not peaceful. It was simply less dangerous than the road. Wounded men came in with mud on their boots and blood in their sleeves. Medics cut away uniforms, checked pulses, tied dressings, started morphine syrettes, and sent the worst cases rearward as fast as the trucks could carry them. Outside, the war kept breathing. Inside, the Red Cross meant something. Under the laws that existed then, medical personnel were not supposed to be treated as ordinary combatants. Wounded prisoners were not supposed to become targets. Aid stations were not supposed to become arenas for revenge. That was the theory. The SS officer had been trained in a different theory. He came from a system that taught some men that the rules were for other people, that mercy was weakness, that rank and ideology could place a human being above the ordinary limits of conduct. By March, that belief had been dragged into a farmhouse under guard. His army was losing. His side was retreating. His certainty had nowhere left to stand. So he reached for the last weapon he still possessed. Contempt. He slapped the medic. The blow itself was small. That is part of what makes it important. No one died in that room. No great battle turned because of it. No general's map changed. No front line shifted. But a protected man had been struck because a prisoner still believed the law would not matter if he acted like it did not exist. The medic could have answered instantly. He had the right anger. He had the witnesses. He had months of dead friends behind him. He had the kind of exhaustion that makes restraint feel like humiliation. But he did not swing back. He reported it. That decision moved the incident out of the room and into the chain of command. And once it entered that chain, it landed on the desk of a man who understood something about the damage one uncontrolled hand could do. Patton had not forgotten Sicily. In August of 1943, during the campaign there, he had walked into field hospitals and slapped 2 American soldiers suffering from what was then called battle fatigue. He believed they were cowards. He was wrong. The incidents became public. Eisenhower reprimanded him. Patton was forced to apologize to the soldiers, to the doctors, and to the men under his command. It did not end his career, but it came close enough that he could feel the cliff under his boots. For months afterward, while other generals moved into commands he wanted, Patton waited. He raged privately. He performed publicly. And he learned, whether he liked the lesson or not, that a general's impulse could become an army's stain. So now, in March of 1945, another slap had entered his command. Only this time it had been delivered by the enemy, and Patton had a choice. He could treat the SS officer the way the SS had treated so many others. He could make an example out of him with fear. He could let the men around him enjoy the satisfaction of a quick answer. Or he could prove that discipline was not just something he demanded from privates in clean helmets. He could demand it from himself. The prisoner was brought forward. The accounts that survive around incidents like this are often thin. Names disappear. Unit numbers blur. Small files vanish into larger files. The medic becomes the medic. The prisoner becomes the SS officer. History remembers the command decision more clearly than the 2 faces in the room. But the shape of the moment is clear. Patton did not explode. He did not slap the man back. He did not have him beaten. He did not order some theatrical punishment and call it justice. He directed that the incident be handled as a violation, a charge, a record, a process, a process. That word sounds dull until you understand what it was standing against. The Nazi system had depended on making violence personal and law meaningless. It had turned human beings into categories, enemies into pests, prisoners into problems, civilians into obstacles, and medical protection into a courtesy that could be ignored. A legal charge reversed that logic. It said the officer was not being punished because Americans hated him. He was being charged because a specific act violated a specific rule. It said the medic mattered not because he was useful, or American, or sympathetic, but because the law said a protected person was protected. It said rank did not erase conduct. It said defeat did not erase responsibility. And it said the record would outlive the room. That is where the real work began. A battlefield army in motion is not a courthouse. It has mud on the floor, fuel shortages in the rear, shells dropping in the next valley, and officers sleeping in chairs with boots still on. But war crimes documentation cannot survive on outrage. Outrage burns hot. Records endure. So witnesses had to be identified. Statements had to be taken. The prisoner had to be named, ranked, and connected to a unit. The act had to be described plainly enough that a lawyer later could understand it, without hearing the medic's voice, without seeing the room, without feeling the insult in the air. That is the part movies skip. They show the slap, they show the general's anger, they show the hard stare. They rarely show the clerk sharpening a pencil at midnight. They rarely show a captain correcting a date. They rarely show an interpreter repeating a warning so the accused cannot later say he was never told. They rarely show a medic, exhausted and embarrassed, giving the same account twice because the first version was not precise enough. But that is what separates revenge from law. Law is not only the grand speech in the courtroom. Sometimes law is a witness statement written carefully while the guns are still audible. And Patton, for all his fury, understood command. He understood that an army is not only judged by what it defeats. It is judged by what it becomes while defeating it. A mob can win a fight. A disciplined army must survive its own victory. That distinction became harder to protect as the Americans pushed deeper into Germany. On March 22, 1945, Patton's forces crossed the Rhine near Oppenheim with the speed and audacity that had become his signature. While other crossings were prepared with massive weight, Patton drove men across quietly at night and then bragged, because of course he did. But the farther Third Army moved, the more it found. Not just enemy positions, not just bridges, not just villages with white sheets and windows. It found evidence, rooms, yards, camps, bodies. Records partly burned and partly abandoned because the people who wrote them had run out of time. On April 4, American forces reached Ohrdruf, a subcamp of the Buchenwald system. It was the first Nazi concentration camp liberated by U.S. troops. The soldiers who entered it were not prepared. No training film could have prepared them. No rumor could have prepared them. No intelligence report could have made the smell, the silence, the bodies, and the machinery of degradation feel real before they saw it. A few days later, Eisenhower came to see it with Bradley and Patton. Patton was not a delicate man. He had seen dead men before. He had made dead men before. He had built a career around the organized use of violence. But Ohrdruf sickened him. Because it was not battle. It was not combat. It was not men dying in the terrible exchange armies make when they fight. It was a system. A system built by people who had decided that law, mercy, evidence, and personhood could all be removed when power found them inconvenient. And suddenly, the small farmhouse incident did not look small in the same way. The SS officer who struck a medic had not built Ohrdruf. He had not designed the camps. He was not one of the men who would sit in the front row at Nuremberg, but he carried the same premise in miniature. The premise that the rules applied only when they served him. That is why the answer mattered. If the Allies were going to say the Nazi system was criminal, they had to prove that their own response would not be criminal theater wearing a uniform. They had to make records. They had to gather evidence. They had to identify acts, names, dates, orders, chains of command, not because the guilty deserved politeness, because the dead deserved proof, because the world would not be rebuilt on a shouted accusation, even when the accusation was true. Nuremberg opened later that year, on November 20, 1945. The defendants there were not obscure prisoners from farmhouse aid stations. They were leaders, ministers, commanders, architects of aggression and mass murder. But the principle in that courtroom reached backward into thousands of smaller wartime decisions. Who took a statement? Who preserved a document? Who refused to turn rage into procedureless punishment? Who believed that evidence mattered before anyone was sure what courtroom would receive it? That was the hidden labor behind justice. Not glorious, not cinematic, not clean, but necessary, because the defense at Nuremberg would not simply say, "We did not do it." They would say the court had no authority. They would say the law was being invented after the fact. They would say the victors were dressing revenge in legal language. The best answer to that was not a louder speech. It was a mountain of documents, orders, photos, camp records, witness testimony, captured files, medical reports, field statements, every piece saying, in effect, this happened, this person did it, this rule existed, this is how we know. The medic's case was only a splinter in that mountain. But splinters matter when they show the grain of the wood. In that farmhouse, the United States Army could have answered an insult with an insult. Instead, it answered with the same idea it was preparing to demand from the world, that a uniform does not place a man above judgment, not an SS uniform, not a general's uniform, not even an American one. That last part is what makes the story sharper than a simple victory tale. Patton was not a saint. He was not gentle. He was not a man naturally inclined to softness. The power of the choice comes from the fact that the easier, harsher, more Patton-like answer was sitting right there. He knew how to intimidate. He knew how to humiliate. He knew how to make men fear him. But in that case, he also knew that fear was not enough. Fear can stop a man in a room. A record can follow him into history. Patton died before the full meaning of Nuremberg settled into the post-war world. In December 1945, after a road accident near Mannheim, the general who had raced armored columns across Europe was left paralyzed by a low-speed collision. He died days later, not on a battlefield, not under artillery, but in a hospital bed with the war already over. He was buried at the Luxembourg American Cemetery among the soldiers of Third Army, rows of white markers, names, dates, ranks, a field of records in stone. That is a fitting place for this story to end, because records are what remain when noise fades. The slap is gone. The farmhouse is gone. The medic's face, in most accounts, is gone. The prisoner's arrogance is gone. But the choice remains. A captured officer violated a protected man. A medic trusted the system instead of his fists. A commander who once failed that test refused to fail it again. A legal officer somewhere turned anger into pages that could survive the war. And from millions of such pages, the world built a harder answer to a very old lie. The lie that power decides who counts. The law did not bring back the dead. It did not cleanse the camps. It did not make war humane. But it did something war almost never does by itself. It made power explain itself. That is what the SS officer did not expect. Not mercy, not weakness, not forgiveness, a record. And sometimes, in the ruins of a world built on force, the most dangerous weapon is the one nobody can slap out of your hands. The medic went back to work. The record stayed.